There's a question historians don't like to ask. It's not about why empires fall. We know why empires fall. They lose wars, they run out of money, they make bad choices. But here's the question nobody wants to answer. What if an empire could survive without ever fixing its problems? What if it could keep importing more than it exports, keep spending more than it earns, and keep running deficits forever? That sounds impossible. And for most of history, it was impossible. But in the 19th century, Britain figured out how to do it. And then America took that blueprint and turned it into the foundation of the modern world. This is not a story about decline. This is a story about invention. Britain invented something completely new in human history. A way for an empire to survive, not by making things the world wanted, but by making the world dependent on things only the empire could provide. And the craziest part? Most people think this system is about trade. It's not. It's about debt. It's about dependency. And it's about what happens when an empire realizes it can export its imbalance instead of fixing it. Let's start with the problem every empire eventually faces. Empires don't expand because they're curious. They expand because they need things. Resources, labor, markets. And expansion works great at first. You conquer new territory, you extract wealth, you build roads and ports and armies. But here's what always happens. The cost of running an empire grows faster than the wealth it produces. You need more soldiers to guard more borders. You need more administrators to manage more provinces. You need more ships to protect more trade routes. And eventually, you hit a wall. You need goods you don't make. You need resources you don't have. And the people who have those things don't want what you're selling. For most of history, this problem had one solution. You fixed the imbalance. You either produced more, consumed less, or you lost your empire. There was no third option. But then Britain discovered something new. What if you didn't fix the imbalance? What if you made the imbalance permanent and forced everyone else to live with it? That's the question Britain answered in the 19th century, and the answer changed everything. By the late 1700s, Britain had a problem. A very specific, very expensive problem: tea. The British people were addicted to Chinese tea. Not metaphorically addicted, actually addicted. Tea had gone from a luxury item to a necessity of daily life. Workers drank it, soldiers drank it, factories ran on it. The British government collected massive tax revenue from it. Tea wasn't just a beverage. It was a pillar of the economy. It kept workers awake during long factory shifts. It kept social order intact. It kept the government funded. Britain needed Chinese tea the way modern economies need oil. It was non-negotiable. But China didn't need anything from Britain. The Qing dynasty looked at British wool, British manufactured goods, British technology, and said, "No, thank you. We have everything we need. If you want our tea, our silk, our porcelain, you pay in silver." And Britain did. Millions of pounds of silver flowed out of Britain and into China every single year, and that created a massive problem. Silver wasn't just money. It was the foundation of Britain's monetary system. When silver drained out of the country, it caused deflation. Prices dropped. Credit tightened. The economy started to seize up, and the government faced a fiscal crisis. This wasn't a minor trade imbalance. This was an existential threat to the empire. Britain tried everything. They tried selling more manufactured goods to China. China wasn't interested. They tried negotiating better terms. China refused. They tried finding alternative sources of tea. There weren't any that could meet demand. So Britain was stuck. They couldn't stop importing tea. They couldn't force China to accept British goods. And they couldn't survive the silver drain forever. For any normal country, this would be the end of the story. You accept the loss, you adjust your economy, you move on. But Britain wasn't a normal country. Britain was an empire, and empires don't adjust. They innovate. Here's what Britain realized. They controlled India, and India had land, lots of land. Land that could grow poppies, poppies that could be turned into opium. And opium was something China didn't have. More importantly, opium was something Chinese people wanted, really wanted. So Britain built a system. They turned large sections of Indian farmland into opium production zones. They created a state-controlled monopoly. They refined the opium, they packaged it, and then they shipped it to the Chinese coast. But here's the clever part. Britain didn't sell the opium directly. That would be too obvious. Instead, they sold it to private British merchants who smuggled it into China. Britain got to deny responsibility while profiting from every sale. It was deniability built into the system. And it worked. Opium flowed into China, silver flowed out of China and into British hands. Britain used that silver to buy tea. The tea went back to Britain, the cycle repeated. Britain had solved its balance of payments crisis not by producing better goods or negotiating better terms, but by exporting addiction. They turned dependency into a commodity. And for the first time in history, an empire had figured out how to survive a permanent trade imbalance. This wasn't imperialism as usual. This was something new. This was the birth of the debt empire. An empire that didn't need to produce more than it consumed. It just needed to control the flow. The opium silver tea circuit became the engine of British imperial finance. At its peak, opium revenues accounted for a huge portion of British India's budget. The entire fiscal structure of the empire depended on narcotics flowing into China and silver flowing back. This wasn't a side hustle. This was the system. And it revealed something crucial about how empires actually work. They don't survive because they're more productive or more innovative. They survive because they can force the terms of trade. They can make others absorb their imbalances. They can export dependency instead of goods. But there was a problem. China wasn't stupid. Chinese officials saw what was happening. Opium addiction was destroying communities. Silver was draining out of the country. The Qing government tried to ban opium. They tried to shut down the ports. They tried to arrest the smugglers. And in 1839, a Chinese official named Lin Zexu went further. He confiscated over 1,000 tons of opium from British merchants and destroyed it. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking her to stop the trade. He appealed to morality, to justice, to basic human decency. He assumed Britain would listen. Britain didn't listen. Because this wasn't about morality. This was about survival. Without the opium trade, the silver drain would resume. The fiscal crisis would return. The empire would be back where it started. So Britain did what empires do when financial arrangements break down. They used force. The first Opium War started in 1839. British gunboats sailed up Chinese rivers. British troops landed on Chinese soil. And within 3 years, China was forced to surrender. The Treaty of Nanking didn't just end the war. It restructured the entire relationship. China had to pay a massive indemnity. China had to open 5 ports to British trade. China had to cede Hong Kong. And most importantly, China had to accept the opium trade. The treaty didn't say that explicitly, but everyone understood. The war wasn't about justice or sovereignty or national pride. It was about preserving a financial circuit that Britain could not afford to lose. And this is where the story gets important. Because the Opium Wars weren't anomalies. They were the enforcement mechanism of the debt empire. When financial dependency is challenged, violence follows. Not because empires are evil, but because empires are systems. And systems defend themselves. The treaties that followed the Opium Wars turned trade into a coercive structure. China didn't just lose a war, China lost control of its own economic policy. And Britain proved that a debt empire could survive indefinitely as long as it was willing to defend the system with force. For decades, this system worked. Britain recycled silver through opium. It funded imperial expansion. It stabilized the pound. It kept tea flowing into London. But here's the thing about empires. They don't last forever. And the more perfect the system becomes, the harder it is to maintain. By the late 1800s, Britain's industrial dominance started to fade. Germany and the United States were catching up. British factories were aging. British exports were losing market share. And then came the 20th century. 2 world wars. Massive debt. The collapse of the gold standard. The end of the British Empire as a global hegemon. By 1950, Britain was finished as the world's dominant power. The pound lost its status as the global reserve currency. The empire shrank. The system that had sustained Britain for a century was dead. But here's what didn't die. The model, the blueprint, the idea that an empire could survive by exporting dependency instead of goods. That idea didn't disappear. It migrated. It found a new host. A bigger balance sheet, a more powerful military, a country that was about to face the exact same problem Britain had faced a century earlier. That country was the United States. After World War II, America was the most productive economy on earth. American factories produced half the world's manufactured goods. American technology was decades ahead of everyone else. American exports flooded global markets. And for a while, that was enough. America didn't need to run deficits. It was the world's creditor, not its debtor. But then something changed. Europe rebuilt, Japan rebuilt, American manufacturers faced competition, and American consumers kept buying. More cars, more electronics, more goods from overseas. By the 1970s, the trade balance had flipped. America was importing more than it exported. The same problem Britain had faced with China was now America's problem with the world. And just like Britain, America faced a choice. Fix the imbalance or export it. Fixing it would mean austerity. It would mean lower consumption. It would mean telling Americans they couldn't have the standard of living they were used to. That wasn't going to happen. So America did what Britain had done. It innovated. But America had one advantage Britain never had: fiat currency. Britain was constrained by silver. Silver was finite. You couldn't just create more of it. But the United States had left the gold standard in 1971. The dollar was no longer backed by anything physical. It was backed by trust, by institutions, by global agreements. And that meant the United States could do something no empire in history had ever been able to do. It could print its own money and export it to the world. Here's how the system works. America runs a trade deficit. It imports goods from China, from Japan, from Germany. It pays for those goods in dollars. But here's the key. Those dollars don't just disappear. They get recycled. Foreign governments and institutions take those dollars and buy U.S. Treasury securities. They lend the money back to America. And America uses that money to keep importing. The cycle repeats. The deficit never has to close. Because the deficit is the product, the debt is the system. This is the perfection of what Britain invented. Britain exported opium to create dependency. America exports debt. And just like opium, that debt binds the world into a system that finances American consumption. Let's be clear about what's happening here. U.S. Treasury securities are not just government bonds. They are the foundational asset of the global financial system. Central banks hold them as reserves. Pension funds hold them as safe assets. Trade settlements require them. Oil is priced in dollars, which means you need dollars to buy oil, which means you need to hold U.S. debt. Participation in the global economy requires absorbing American deficits. It's not optional. It's structural. And that structure looks a lot like Britain's opium trade, not morally, but mechanically. Both systems create dependency. Both systems recycle flows back to the empire. Both systems allow the empire to consume more than it produces. The only difference is scale and sophistication. Britain used gunboats and colonial administrators. America uses payment infrastructure and financial institutions. Britain forced open Chinese ports with cannons. America embeds dollar dominance into the architecture of global trade. SWIFT, the global payment messaging system, runs on dollars. Commodities are priced in dollars. Sanctions are enforced in dollars. If you want access to global markets, you play by dollar rules. And playing by dollar rules means holding U.S. debt. This is why America can run trillion-dollar deficits without facing a currency crisis. The world needs dollars more than America needs balanced trade. The system Britain invented has been abstracted, institutionalized, and scaled to a level Britain could never have imagined. But here's the part nobody talks about. This system has limits. It always has. And history is very clear about what those limits are. Every reserve currency empire in recorded history has followed the same pattern. They start by producing goods the world wants. Then they start borrowing to maintain their position. Then debt servicing starts to consume an increasing share of revenue. And when debt servicing hits around 1/3 of state revenue, the system enters a phase from which no empire has ever recovered without losing its status. The math stops working. The empire is no longer borrowing to invest. It's borrowing to service old debts. And once you cross that threshold, there are only three options: austerity, which destroys political legitimacy; inflation, which destroys the currency; or default, which destroys trust. Every option leads to the same place: loss of reserve currency status, loss of empire. Britain learned this the hard way. After World War II, British debt was unsustainable. The pound was under constant pressure. Britain tried to hold on. It imposed austerity. It devalued the currency. It negotiated loans from the United States, but none of it worked. By the 1960s, the pound had lost its role as a global reserve currency. The system Britain had built was over. The empire didn't collapse overnight. But it stopped being an empire. It became a regional power. The transition wasn't violent. It was financial. And it was irreversible. Now look at the United States. Federal debt is over $30 trillion. Debt servicing costs are rising faster than revenue. The dollar's share of global reserves is slowly declining. Other countries are testing alternatives. China is building parallel payment systems. Russia is trading oil in currencies other than dollars. The European Union is pushing for strategic autonomy. These aren't coordinated attacks. They're responses to the same problem every empire's dependents eventually face. Why should we absorb someone else's deficits forever? The absence of a clear alternative has delayed the transition. But delay is not prevention. History suggests the transition is coming. The only question is when. And here's the terrifying part. The better the system works, the harder it fails. Britain's opium system delayed adjustment for decades. But when it collapsed completely. America's Treasury-based system has delayed adjustment for even longer. It's more efficient, more invisible, more global. But that also means more dependence, more interconnected failures, more systemic risk. When confidence in a reserve currency breaks, it doesn't happen slowly. It happens all at once. Because confidence is binary. You either trust the system or you don't. And once trust is gone, no amount of policy can bring it back. This is the paradox of perfection. Britain invented the debt empire as a survival mechanism. It worked. For a while. Then it stopped working. America perfected the debt empire by removing the physical constraints Britain faced. It worked even better, for even longer. But perfection doesn't mean permanence. It means the system becomes too big to reform without breaking it. Every choice that made the system more efficient also made it more fragile. Every innovation that extended its lifespan also deepened the dependency. And dependency, when pushed beyond sustainable limits, eventually turns into resentment. Resentment turns into alternatives. And alternatives turn into exits. We're not watching the collapse of the American empire because of bad policy or moral failure or incompetence. We're watching the same process that ended every reserve currency empire in history. The process where financial asymmetry sustained too long undermines the very confidence that made it possible. Britain invented a way to delay imperial decline through financial engineering. America perfected it. But history doesn't care about perfection. It cares about math. And the math always wins. Here's what the British learned and what America is learning now. You can export dependency. You can recycle financial flows. You can make the world absorb your imbalances. You can build institutions that make compliance feel normal. You can even convince yourself that the system is fair, that it benefits everyone, that it's just how the world works. But you can't escape the final constraint, confidence. And confidence, once lost, is never recovered. Not through bailouts, not through innovation, not through force. When a debt empire loses the world's trust, it doesn't decline gradually. It falls suddenly. Because the imbalance was always there. The system just hid it. And when the hiding stops, the fall is not a surprise. It's a return to reality. Britain invented the debt empire to survive a monetary crisis. America perfected it to dominate the global economy. And history suggests that no empire, no matter how powerful, no matter how sophisticated, survives its own perfection. The system works until it doesn't. And when it stops working, it stops all at once.